When you give to a charity fighting to rid the world of poverty, how much impact does your donated dollar really have on a single individual living in abject poverty? Well, in many cases, not much. One organization is out to change that and how we all think about charitable giving. Michael Faye is the co-founder and chairman of Give Directly, a top-ranked international charity that advocates for direct giving to people with the most need. The Guardian writes that Give Directly sent shockwaves through the charity sector when it introduced the idea of making cash transfers directly to the poor. Faye's model essentially eliminates the NGO middleman by quickly and efficiently transferring funds from donors right into the hands of those who need it most. Michael Faye joins us now from New York City to discuss how he's changing the charity landscape and why it's working so well. Michael, welcome to Full Frame.
Thanks, Faye. Pleasure to be here.
Well, Michael, this is definitely a unique concept. It's pretty much cutting out the middleman, as I just said, and there's no strings to this. The donor directly sends the money to the person in need. When you first came up with this idea and you started sharing the concept, did people sort of question the whole idea?
Yeah, I think it was a mix. I think there are folks in this sector, the development sector, that were quite familiar with the idea. It wasn't a new idea, and there was quite a bit of evidence for cash when we got started. And those folks were really quite supportive. Now, I think there is the general public and there is skepticism about cash in general. There's also a lot of skepticism about whether people would actually give in this way.
And so tell me, why does direct cash work?
Well, I think you're really putting trust into the poor and allowing them to make decisions on their own behalf. I think if I'm sitting in a room in New York or D.C. or London, it's going to be a lot harder for me to understand what that recipient or poor person needs than for themselves to know what they need.
Well, let's talk about how it actually works then. Let's start from the donor's end. How does a donor go about deciding who the money goes to, and how does that transaction work?
Yeah, so this is quite easy. It's like going to any other website. I think if you go to our website, givedirectly.org, you have a choice of which country to give to, and right now you can give to either Kenya or Uganda. Okay. There are slightly different efficiency ratios for each, so 91 cents on each dollar gets to the poor in Kenya and about 85 cents in Uganda. Okay. You select your option and go from there.
91 cents and you said 85 cents. That's pretty good in terms of how much actually goes to the person in need.
We think so. And we think even more basically simply asking the question of other organizations, how much of the dollar that I'm donating reaches the final recipient, is a first step.
That's right. Yeah, I think a lot of folks wonder about that whenever they give to a charity. All right, let's then talk about the recipient. They receive the money directly, and how does that take place?
That's right. So the first step is finding the recipient, and to be eligible for Give Directly, you need to be extremely poor. A Give Directly recipient, on average, is living on about 65 cents a day.
Wow.
We then go through a number of back checks and follow-ups to make sure that the person is actually poor and who we think they are. Once that process is complete, we enroll them in the system. We register them by providing them a SIM card for mobile money, and then transfer them money. They get a text, and they could either pick up that money at a local agent or hold that money and save it on their phone.
And you just mentioned, Michael, that you go through a lot of background checks to make sure that this person is legitimate. You've never had an issue with fraud or somebody trying to misuse these funds?
I think everybody working in the sector has had an issue with fraud, and the real question is how you minimize that. Yeah. We had one which we've been very public about, and think it's important to be public about these things in Uganda, where we lost about 2% of a budget. The question is, how quickly do you catch it, and how quickly do you adapt to it?
Okay, and how were you able to manage that then?
So it's a combination of management and technology. So we use everything from satellite image to automated fraud alerts to feedback mechanisms with staff compensation to prevent fraud going forward.
Okay, so that's the fraud element. But what about these are real recipients of this money, but how do you ensure that that person doesn't then go and misuse the funds? I mean, they may be poor and they may have needs, but what if they go and spend the money on alcohol or drugs or other things that obviously aren't being used? They're using the money for other things that aren't needed.
Well, it's interesting, and I think for a long time we've thought that we needed to put constraints on the poor for what they could use the money for. And the reality is that poverty itself puts constraints on the recipient. If you're living in abject poverty on 65 cents a day, when you get a transfer of cash, your first thought is not, how do I go have fun? Which bar should I go to? Right. It's how can I make my family's life better? And even how can I survive?
Right. Right. Well, tell me then, Michael, you guys have the proof. You have the stories of how this works. Give me some examples of how lives have been changed through this mechanism that you've created.
There are examples of everything. There's lots of recipients that have bought motorbikes to start taxi businesses. Recipients will use the money to send their kids to school. A fair number of recipients use it for the simplest of things that we take for granted, putting a roof on their heads, which not only obviously improves the dignity of their lives, but is actually a great investment for them. And the list goes on from there.
Michael, why hasn't someone done this before? You mentioned earlier that this isn't something totally new, but really it's not that commonplace. So do you think this is something that's going to continue to catch on?
I sure hope so, and it's interesting. I think people talk about Give Directly as something new and leading this movement towards direct giving and cash transfers. And the reality is that many people were doing it before. The government of Brazil, the government of Mexico, and many others were doing cash transfer programs, which actually provided the evidence upon which Give Directly is based. Without those programs, we wouldn't have known that cash worked.
Right.
What people haven't done, and where I think Give Directly has really pushed it, is opening that up to the general public and saying, let's go beyond the large institutions and governments and allow anyone in the general public to give directly.
And I guess I should ask you, Michael, how is it going in terms of donations? Are you seeing a steady rise in the number of donations and donors participating in this program?
We've been delighted. We recently crossed the $100 million mark.
Wow.
Of cumulative donations. So it's just been a tremendous amount of support for folks to the poor. And I think it's folks that have placed a real priority on evidence. It's folks trusting the poor. And I think it's growing.
That's $100 million. That is incredible, Michael. Well, let's talk about how much an average donation, how much of a difference it can make. $50, let's say you donate to Uganda. What's that $50 going to do?
This is transformative for people. And again, to put this in context, people are living on 65 cents a day. So for the price of coffee each morning, you could basically double their income.
Jeez.
For $50, you can buy enough maize to last a family probably for about 2 months. You could buy several pigs. It really goes quite far abroad in these countries.
All right. Well, Michael, thank you so much for sharing your story about Give Directly. Sounds like you guys are doing incredible work, so keep it up.
I appreciate it, May. Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. All right, we'll be right back with this week's Full Frame Close-Up.